Welcome to the second installation of equity-centered assessment model. This is the second mini lecture in a series of three, and the focus of this one is going to be on a framework for equity-minded and equity-centered assessment. On the screen is a link to some additional resources if you want to learn a little bit more. And if you don't know who I am, my name is Gavin Henning. It was he, him, his pronouns. Professor of Higher Education here at New England College, where I direct our Doctor of Education and our Master of Science in Higher Education Administration programs. So let's start with the first recap. In the first mini lecture, I talked a little bit about why we should really be thinking about equity in the assessment process, partly because assessment doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by things such as societal culture, institutional context, the individuality or the positionality of the individual doing the assessment, and there are some outcomes on that. So there's this almost this chain that really begins with what happens before the assessment's even done. Building thinking about equity in our assessment process can help improve graduation rates, which bring individual benefits, particularly regarding increased earnings, and there's some societal benefits as well. And in regard to the research and scholarship, there's a long history of this work going back to the 1930s. The terms and the concepts have evolved over time and been nuanced, and they'll continue to evolve. But the commonality between all of it is this connection between equity, even if it's called inclusion or diversity or multiculturalism, is built into the assessment and evaluation process. The focus of this session is really to talk about a framework that can be used to kind of pull this all together and conceptualize these different types of assessment that integrate equity. And I use the terms both equity-minded and equity-centered. And what I mean by equity-minded is using equity as a lens for assessment, where the goal is to really make sure we do assessment in an equitable way. Where equity-centered assessment is a new opportunity for higher education. Now, the focus is on assessment and the focus is using assessment for equity. And so what I would argue is that all of our assessments should be equity-minded, but we should think about how do we use assessment that can be equity-centered. So the focus of assessment is actually to foster equity. So really as a vehicle for that. My colleague Ann Lundquist and I pulled together this framework because we really were trying to get a sense like how do all these different types of concepts, how do they relate? How do they fit together? And this was the framework we came up with. On the left side is causing harm, because we believe if folks don't think about this idea of equity and their role in the assessment process, we could be potentially causing harm when we implement assessment. And then we pulled together some of the key elements or some of the key concepts in the history of the literature and scholarship into this framework. The top part is the equity-minded element. So the concepts in blue are really about how do we make sure we integrate or we do assessment in an equitable way. And then the green ones are different ways we can use assessment to further equity. So bias-free assessment is pretty much what you would expect. How do we make sure that we don't include bias into our assessment? And I think most people are doing this already, making sure that the questions are inclusive, making sure that the demographic items on a survey for implementing a survey are current and inclusive of all identities. Culturally responsive assessment is really about considering students' culture and what they bring to the learning experience and how their learning and knowledge development may be different. When we think about higher education, it's very Western in terms of what our assumptions and our beliefs around how knowledge is created. But culturally responsive assessment takes kind of questions that a little bit and says that students can approach this learning experience in different ways. And for us to really support student learning, we need to take into account their cultures. Socially just assessment it's a new phase that focuses really on how do we understand the role of power in learning and in knowledge creation. Some voices are more valid than others in our history books, in some of the content that we teach. And so keeping in mind that power has an impact on learning, not only in terms of the content that we share, but also the way students construct learning. Deconstructive assessment builds on this critical foundation of socially just assessment and really focuses on some postmodernist perspective where Power and oppression in higher education exist in our social structures, our policies, our practices, our curricula. And so for deconstructed assessment, which is really one of the first elements where we can actually use assessment to further equity, assessment is used to really deconstruct some of those social structures to understand the ways that power and oppression are built into them. Because once we can begin to make the role of power and oppression more explicit, and we're aware of that, we can make those changes. Because typically that power and oppression is non-intentional, it's unconscious. And oftentimes we try to build these policies to actually address equity, but may unconsciously further inequities. Anti-racist assessment focuses on how our programs, services, policies, practices, curricula are unconsciously racist. Do all of the writers of the books or the readings we include in our class, are they all white, for example? Decolonizing assessment, similar, but the focus on really a broader Western paradigms. How do the way we think about our assumptions around knowledge creation, knowledge transmission, how does that affect the learning environment and how we go about teaching our students in our classrooms? And thinking about some non-Western approaches, not just in people, the writers of some of the readings we include, but just the way we think about different knowledge systems and ways of knowing. And the assessment for social justice is the culmination of all of these. So really pulling together all those elements of equity-minded and equity-centered assessment to really engage in assessment that both is equitable and is intentionally a vehicle for furthering equity on campus. So that's a quick overview. There's a further reading in that resource folder with some more details. But think about how you might use a framework like this. Perhaps it's a guide for taking a look at your syllabus. Maybe it's a guide for how you're doing assignments and thinking about the types of assignments that you allow. Are they all writing assignments, for example, where it makes sense in a writing course, but maybe not in a sociology course? So think about how that framework might be helpful. I want to share a few considerations for implementation around equity-minded and equity-centered assessment. The first is think about our own identities and how they impact the way we teach and assess. I prefer to read rather than watch videos, but I understand that other people prefer the videos and they learn better that way. So I'm trying to build in more video types of resources, not just text-based resources. Think about how higher education and our teaching has colonized and privileges Western ways of knowing. Even this concept of validity within the sciences, and particularly the social sciences, is fraught and based on power and privilege, and used as a colonizing strategy to validate some kinds of knowing, but not other kinds of knowing. There's a great article by Cushman about this role of validity. And Kirkhart talks about multicultural validity, thinking about validity that's applicable to multiple individuals and cultures and not just rooted in Western paradigms. I think good teaching requires good assessment. We have to know what's working, what's not working, both in terms of how our students are learning, but what's working with our teaching strategies. And I think it's helpful to align our program outcomes, course learning activities, course assignments, and our grading and course assessments, and mapping these all together, because that's where we can begin to identify gaps in equity, but also some opportunities to further equity within our classroom, not just in the assignments, but even in the way we construct our entire course, because they're going to be related to those assignments and how we assess student learning. And taking a pause to consider our teaching and assessment methods, so what can be called equity pauses, and thinking about who they include and who they exclude. We had our doctoral residency on campus earlier this month in August. We got some feedback from a student who has a visual disability that we weren't being inclusive when we had a virtual speaker. The slides weren't shared earlier. We actually, when the presenter shared her screen, her picture was really small. The slides were big, which was great. But if somebody needs to read lips, for somebody who has a hearing disability, a small picture is not going to work. And so thinking about how can we be more inclusive and in all of the ways we teach our students and build our classrooms. And also think about the assignments we choose to use and how we grade those. How much of the assignment is measuring the learning versus how to navigate the assignment itself? And so really thinking about the assignment as a demonstration of learning, not just navigation of that assignment, assignment and how to do that assignment, and really just thinking about how do we focus on the learning itself. And in summary, the equity-minded and equity-centered assessment framework pulls together a lot of different types of assessment that integrate equity in a way that hopefully provides some conceptual framework pulling those together, but also thinking about the different ways we can integrate equity into the assessment process. Thinking about always doing equity-minded assessments, so we use equity as a lens through our assessment process, but also really thinking about the opportunity of assessment as a vehicle or a tool to advance equity, because that has been an untapped resource so far. So we can really think about using assessment in that way. And that framework can be a guide for developing courses, creating assessments, or just thinking about teaching and learning in general. And in the third installment of the series, I'll talk a little bit about some specific strategies that can be used to ensure equity within the assessment process.